He is currently professor of social studies at Bard College in New York. He's had a varied and distinguished career as a scholar and as an activist. He is a former psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and he was the 1998 Green Party candidate for U.S. Senate from New York for the seat that eventually went to some guy named Schumer or something. And in 2000, he sought the Green Party candidacy for president that eventually went to Ralph Nader. He is the author of 10 books, including The Enemy of Nature, subtitled The End of Capitalism or The End of the World. He says the subtitle says it all. And this has just come out in its second edition. He's also editor of the scholarly quarterly called Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. So most importantly for tonight, he is the author of Overcomming Zionism, the most exciting book I've read in a long time. And without further ado, the NorCal support group of the International Solidarity Movement and the Berkeley Fellowship's Social Justice Committee are proud and honored to present Dr. Joel Kovel.
I've been in this hall before in May 1994 for the funeral of my father-in-law, Fred Drosten. Fred and Mary Drosten were staunch Unitarians, were founding two congregations, one in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and one in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I know they both would have been very happy and proud to be here today because for them, social justice was a burning passion. So I dedicate this lecture to their memory. And this is the book, and I'm going to begin with a little reading from it. But I'll tell you how it was stimulated. Recently, Michael Lerner of Tikkun magazine sent an email around saying that, well, Israel's coming up on its 60th anniversary, and we want to have some brief comments on where it stands after 60 years, and how would you like to do this? And of course, I haven't done it yet, but I thought to myself, well, that's a good idea, and I think I'll do it. But then I thought, maybe I can just copy some things from my book, and while I probably won't, I do think I might want to read to you the pages of my book. First of all, because you can get at least some flavor of the book itself. The rest of the book maybe contains a word or two from the book, but mostly be a commentary on what I'm going to read you now. And this is from the 8th chapter of the book, which is called Slouching Towards Jerusalem. And the chapter is divided into two parts, the first part being a critical analysis of the ultra-Orthodox and the settlers that infest the West Bank and much of Israel. And the second is a critique of the liberal Zionist historian Benny Morris, who actually made some major contributions towards the unmasking of the myths that surrounded particularly the wars of 1948, which were always considered to be pure defensive wars on the part of the struggling Zionists against the Arab hordes. And Morris and others, such as Ilan Pappert, but Morris, in this case, made major contributions to the history by showing that what happened in 1948 was in fact massive ethnic cleansing, which was deliberately planned, and that the standard story was simply, what I just said, namely a myth. What was remarkable about Morris's findings, though, was that instead of drawing the conclusion that there was something wrong about this, he then went on to say this is the way it should have been. He was only sorry that they didn't do the job fully and get rid of all of the Palestinians, which identifies him as a member of the species Homo Zionismus. And he gave us a remarkable interview, which is published in the liberal paper Haaretz, in January 2004, and I'm going to read you from the last part of that interview, of my discussion of that interview, because it gives a good vantage on how my book treats this problem and opens a space for the remainder of the talk. And so here I go. Employing another well-worn trope of justification that the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians was justifiable because done in a great cause, Morris says, quote, "Even the great American democracy could not have been created without the annihilation of the Indians. There are cases in which the overall final good justifies harsh and cruel acts that are committed in the course of history." Unquote. Then I continue. This is a you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs argument, and is a well-known rationalization for aggression. It is a dull, heartless, and mechanical view of history, which in this instance opens upon some reflections. The annihilation of the American Indians can truly be called a kind of Holocaust, differing from what Nazi Germany did to the Jews and others such as Romani, chiefly in the extended way it unfolded and in the markedly different prior histories of perpetrator and victim. It is certainly the case that the United States, as it exists today, would not have arisen without annihilating the Indians, just as it would not have arisen as we know it without chattel slavery of black Africans. But the United States as it exists, and what Morris calls the, quote, great American democracy, unquote, should not be conflated. There have been contributions made by the United States to democracy, but these may be reckoned as having arisen despite the atrocious record of Indian killing, either as the product of innumerable struggles from below to democratize the conditions of life, or more pointedly, from various appropriations of Indian ways. These latter would include the lessons the framers of United States democracy learned from the egalitarian Indian societies, especially of the Iroquois nations, and also the countless examples of the free intermingling of common peoples, the going native on the part of whites, especially women, as well as communal arrangements between Indians, escaped slaves, and poor whites, at times of a frankly utopian character. The American democracy would have turned out much better had such processes prevailed instead of the genocide against the indigenous. This could have happened. That it didn't happen is a matter of having the wrong class forces ending up on top, from which place they could impose their economic dominion and systematic racism, according to the ethos of Puritan elites. It was these who carried out the extermination of Indians, often co-opting the lower classes into their project, and it is to a very great extent this annihilation, along with slavery, indentured servitude, and the violent suppression of workers, that has made America a racist society and eventuated in a nation-state whose democratic facade has accompanied and helped to conceal an endlessly repeated record of blood, fire, and lawless intervention. Benny Morris puts on rose-colored glasses when looking at Israel's great protector. But the country of which Simon Bolivar said back in 1828 that it was destined to plague the world in the name of democracy, and which entered the 21st century with a man of the caliber of George W. Bush as its president, and a population riddled with Christian fundamentalism, has a lot to answer for, including, to be sure, its partnership with Israel, which, of course, the atrocious letter from Barack Obama indicates full well, as does 1,000 other pieces of evidence. There are a few generalizations that hold up across the historical spectrum. One of these is the necessity of coming to grips with one's national past in order not to repeat its crimes. The United States has a dreadful record of not accepting responsibility for its history, and so it constantly repeats its crimes. Think of how much better the great American democracy would be if it were to begin to confront its murderous past. One sign of which would be to build a great museum about the annihilation of indigenous cultures, and another one on the slave trade and its consequences, alongside, or even, heaven forfend, instead of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, which directs attention from America's lost history. Because what the United States did to its Indians and black slaves is at the center of its existence and demands priority. And the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem should be accompanied by a museum along the lines of the great museum in Johannesburg that gives witness to the crimes of a racist apartheid regime and to their overcoming. Because the racist expropriation and oppression of an indigenous people is at the center of the existence of Israel, just as it was of apartheid South Africa, and will not begin to be overcome unless it is recognized and reflected upon. One might imagine a series of exhibition rooms in such a museum, dedicated to the various transgressions spawned by Zionism from its inner being, inexorable deductions from the bad idea. The second chapter, which is the history of Zionism, is titled The Unnatural History of a Bad Idea. And that's just what I think of Zionism. Simply a bad idea. More than simply a bad idea, but it's thought it's a bad idea. So these are the hypothetical, hoped-for rooms in the history museum that should be built in Jerusalem about the transgressions of the Israeli state. First room. From its beginnings, Israel has been internally compelled to annihilate an existing indigenous society. Once it achieved statehood, and especially as it became occupier of what Palestinian land was left over from 1948, it turned itself into a machine for the manufacture of human rights abuses. Next. These latter necessarily and normally configure about an all-pervading ethnocentricity that readily turns racist and is sown throughout society. The culmination is a system as structurally racist as apartheid South Africa, however distinct many of the external features may be. Israel produces militarism with its associated disregard for life in every corner of society and spreads this around the region and beyond, attacking its neighbors in an incessant drumbeat of aggression. It has perverted the memory of the greatest calamity ever to befall the Jewish people, the Shoah, or Holocaust, in order to aggrandize itself. Alongside this, it has degraded a great world religion, Judaism, and fostered the rise within it of a narrow fundamentalism and stifling orthodoxy, tool to the needs of the state. It has severely undercut the principle of lawfulness through its flouting of innumerable UN resolutions designed to check its behavior. Most seriously, it has actively contributed to the deadly spread of nuclear weapons by withholding its own arsenal, built clandestinely with the disgraceful collusion of the United States from any international covenant. It has further and bizarrely entangled itself with the United States, doing the latter's dirty work in a relationship that has deeply corrupted American politics and driven American Jewry into a moral abyss. Said dirty work has included material support for a great many vicious regimes whose chief stock in trade has been violent repression. For example, apartheid South Africa, with whose weapons industries Israel worked hand in glove, and to whom Israel smuggled automatic weapons and other anti-personnel devices to violently suppress its uprisings in its own bandstands in the streets, disregarding the will of the international community. This culminated in working hand in glove with the apartheid regime to help it build nuclear weapons. It has hastened, Israel has hastened, the environmental degradation endemic to capitalist society by its demographic pressure, its oppression of Palestinians, its militarism, and its lawlessness. Finally, it has been the greatest single instigator in the rise of political Islam, the hinge around which much of our history turns. It is one of the great ironies that dog Zionism, that rising as a reaction against the persecutory tendencies of the West, it should have become the spearhead of Western persecution with dreadful consequences. Nobody has put this better than the distinguished critic Edward Herman. Quote, "The situation in Palestine is also very important," writes Herman, "because hundreds of millions of Arabs and a billion or more people in the Islamic land, and a billion or more people of the Islamic faith, and billions beyond that, interpret the West's treatment of the Palestinians as a reflection of a racist and colonialist attitude towards Arabs, Islamists, and third world people more broadly. It is a producer of anti-Western terrorism, but also, and even more importantly, a deep anger, hatred, and distrust of the West and its motives. It is a cancer that bodes ill for the future of the human condition. Unquote. To all of these charges, the Zionists will respond. It's not our fault, but that of Arab barbarism, terrorism, and the anti-Semitism that is built into the human genome and persecutes the Jews down through the ages. This is the intellectual surface of the above-mentioned moral abyss. Hopefully, the arguments advanced in this work will have helped to put to rest this shameful line of reasoning by exposing the roots of the problem in the Jewish state and the Zionism that animates it. Put most directly, the fateful and ultimately fatal decision for Zionism that brings on all these abuses in training. Having demonstrated so much, however, only takes us to the threshold of what matters. What can be done about this state? How can a just peace arise in the tormented land of Israel, Palestine? Now, that's where my spontaneous, my informal remarks tonight will build. I submit to you that this list of indictments is corroborated in considerable detail in the 190 pages which precede it, and I'm glad to fill in any of the blanks, but I want to start with that. And before taking on the question of what is to be done, however, consider something that has also been talked about on the previous pages, but not in what I've read so far, namely, really what animates this. Why does this kind of terrible record persist, and indeed persist consistently over the 60 years of the existence of the Jewish state of Israel? And this is, after all, a considerable amount of time, and it's a substantial amount of time to come up with an assessment of what the actual or true condition of this creature is. Because, I mean, in 60 years, repeating the same thing over and over and over again, it's it's a little tedious just to keep reading again and again of one violation or another. After what you say, well, it's like, I pick up this book and drop it again, and pick up the book and drop it again, and drop it again. And sometimes you think, well, maybe there's a law that brings things down and causes them to fall to the center of the earth. And yes, oh, gravity. Okay, well, there's another there are other principles at work here. And there's a great tendency on the part of, I may have to take a little more time because I think you got off to a late start. So, if you'll forgive me. I thought I just got started. Okay. The tendency. Yes, this is a, and that's a good word, tendency. These phenomena are they're driven by certain conditions, and I want to talk some about them and talk about them in a multi-leveled way, including what happened to this book itself, because Overcomming Zionism was received with tremendous indifference and silence by the official world of media of all sorts. It still, as a matter of fact, hasn't had an above-ground review in any liberal publication, any newspaper of any kind of note. And I will say that I expected as much, because I'm familiar with the terrain and how it works with books and statements that stand outside of the accepted consensus with what is allowed to be sayable in our fair society. But I was hoping for better, and indeed I got better, and I got better news in the middle of the summer, in August to be exact, when the book distributor, the University of Michigan Press, received a broadside from a group called Stand With Us Michigan. A word of explanation: the book is published by Pluto Press, a British publisher, to which I turned after failing to get an American publisher. And Pluto has to be distributed, and it's distributed by the University of Michigan, of course, a very major, powerful liberal institution, a splendid record of defending civil rights and anti-discrimination measures and the like. And here comes this Stand With Us Michigan to say that, oh, Kovel, here's a book from Kovel which is anti-Semitic in its core. This book is an abomination. It is a disgrace to the University of Michigan to carry this book and to carry books of similar stripe from the Pluto Press. And we just want you to know that we're going to keep after you until you get this book off the list. And well, when I saw that, I was actually shocked and but kind of elated in a way too. I said, oh, maybe I hit the jackpot. And maybe my book has really made a difference. It's gotten under their skin. You know, first malign neglect, and now let's see if we can kill this. And lo and behold, 72 hours after these diatribes appeared, the editorial director of the University of Michigan Press, and then I'd known him for 20 years, sent me an email which said, in so many words, that he started out with the assumption that he wanted to protect and defend my book because of the principles of free speech, but that after reading the book, because he hadn't read it before, he said this is really lying. But anyway, he said that, and that he was, quote, appalled by the vicious and hateful attack that I had made on all the institutions of Israel, and how completely beyond any limit this book was, and that therefore it could not be defended as free speech because it was hate speech. Now setting it, and as a result, he's going to drop it from the list of the University of Michigan Press. Now, setting aside the nonsense that profound misinterpretation of what the defense of free speech is, which is that you defend something not because you like it, because it's there and should be heard by the general public. And if it's hateful, well, you should still defend the right to say it. But you also might say, well, you've heard me read several pages from the book, which are fairly, well, let's face it, they're not friendly to the state of Israel. They're fairly serious critiques, but and undoubtedly animated by outrage. But to say this is hate speech is perhaps a bit extreme, is it not? Because hate speech is just something that's unmodulated hate. I do think that I managed to put together my anger into a sequence of logical arguments that expressed with some degree of decorum and style, and you know, it's just not plain hate speech. But even if it were, they shouldn't have done what they did, which is ban it. Okay, effectively burn it, because you know, if you don't distribute a book, then the process of atmospheric degradation take over. It's a slow burning of the book. Keep it on the shelf long enough, it will disappear, and nobody will read it. Treat it all forest, and nobody heard, etc., etc., etc. Now, this tells us some very important things, obviously. It tells us that liberal institutions, which Michigan is one, and others standing in place, are maybe internally contradictory, and that their hold on the principles of democratic discourse is perhaps a tenuous one, that there's some kind of internalized signal that the publisher and the distributor here picked up that triggered his own panicky response, which was a dreadful mistake, by the way, because aside from issues of free speech, he was violating the contracts, and the contract says they have to distribute the books of Pluto. And in fact, when the University of Michigan, his superiors found this out, they were pretty angry at him and said, you can't do this. So they actually put the book back in, but then they tried to get rid of Pluto Press, which went on for several months. So we rallied as a group. You can look it up on the internet. It's called CODZ.org. It's Committee for Open Discussion of Zionism, which is the principle behind it, .org, CODZ.org, and you have details about this struggle, which hopefully enough got 650 letters written to the University of Michigan supporting this book and Pluto Press, all of which suffice to turn them around and reinstate the book, which is why we can have this event today and you can buy the book, although we don't have enough copies. But they're out there, you can get them, and that's a good thing. But you know, no, it's a good thing because there was struggle. There were several struggles. People were willing to stand up and denounce the great university for its violation of the principles of the university. And in writing this book, I had taken the strategic goal in mind of simply disregarding a whole set of taboos. I'm going to talk about all these taboos in a bit. But it seemed to me that it was a very important principle, and it's one that we all should take upon ourselves to write in this sphere with the utmost candor and disregard for those strictures on discourse that pertain to the state of Israel and the Zionism that animates it. And this is particularly critical in this area because, you know, there's a great many controversial areas in our society, but there really is nothing comparable to this for the sense of moral tension and contradiction and explosiveness that it exists in. And in fact, in developing the text of the book, brought forth a concept which I called, and I'm happy I did this, called Zionism's bad conscience. And that bad conscience has to do with the following, that people who adhere to the Zionist ways, and which is essentially can be stated in the following terms, that the historical destiny of the Jewish people is to have a state of, for, and by them in historic Palestine. This is the destiny and the fulfillment of the Jewish people. The state of Israel is not a state even for the Jewish people within its borders, but for all the Jews in the world. And I bet this probably half the people in this room are Jewish. I'm Jewish by background. Therefore, I am entitled to apply for membership in the state of Israel anytime I want. But not, you know, they're not going to take me into a vote. Nor is any tension on this point. But anyone, I could have, a year ago, would have gotten it easily because my mama was Jewish, and that makes me Jewish, and this is, according to the logic of Zionism, the only way I can become a true Jew and a true human being is to be a citizen of the state of Israel and endorse its policies, and the state of Israel therefore has to be a Jewish state. Otherwise, Jewish people don't exist as human beings, and that's a really powerful problem, isn't it? I mean, that has explosive contradictions built into it. Last night I spoke in Chico, a similar talk, and the guy who introduced me said that one of his friends, who's Jewish, he was himself not Jewish, but he said he had a Jewish friend, when he heard about the talk, said, I can't go to this talk. I said, well, why? I said, well, because, I mean, if I take seriously a horrible talk like this, then my identity as a Jew is shattered. You may laugh, but that's a serious question. I mean, if you feel as your identity, that's to say your coherence and extension as a human being, and integration with the life of your times, with the past and your goals in the future, is dependent upon loyalty to this state, okay? And if you're so afraid of listening to any criticism of this state, then you have a very, very fragile state of identity, and your whole life is going to be constricted and constrained. Now, I don't want to say this is a tragic situation. If the man had come to me and told me that, well, should I attend your lecture because it might shatter my identity as a Jew, and that's really what he said. Listen, I've been a psychoanalyst, all right? I stopped being it, but I was really into that. And I would say to himself, deep interpretation. I'd say, get over it. Get over it. You're a grown-up. You know, it's not the end of the world. And then I'd say something else. I'd say, you know, sir, hypothetically, sir, you should be a bit ashamed of yourself. Maybe not guilty, but ashamed of yourself for worrying about your identity when your identity depends upon so supporting a state that does the things that I just iterated and which can be demonstrated by any glance at any one of 100 historical sources and references. That you're going to say that your identity depends on a state that torments and tries to annihilate an entire people, that in order to preserve your Jewishness, you're going to have to blind yourself to what is going on in the world. Is this a worthy way of living your life? Is anybody, Jew or not? I mean, I think there's a tremendous crisis here, but the bad conscience of Judaism which is exhibited by that phenomenon or by Benny Morris's phenomenon, because he goes nuts when he has to deal with the fact that he really wanted these transgressions to take place. You see, the problem with Judaism, and not Judaism, sorry, Zionism, because what it sucks Judaism into, the moral abyss. This is the moral abyss that it sucks Judaism into. The problem with Zionism is that it's one of the existential options open to Jewish people at the close of the 19th century. There may, roughly speaking, were four of them. One was to continue in traditional ways and become pious and, move into the orthodoxies and retreat from the world and live your life that way, which is a perfectly clean choice for me. But then there was, within the religions, there's an otherworldly or aesthetic quality. Then there's the worldly side. So there are three worldly choices for Jews to take. One, most of the people here in this room who are Jewish are manifestations of that choice, which is to join the migrations to the Western capitalist, advanced, modernist nations from the Eastern European warrens where most of the Jews of the world live, in Central Europe, Eastern Europe. Over 4 million people migrated in the period 1880 to 1920, more commonly the Jewish people. And of course, to this country in particular, where the Jewish people became so extraordinarily successful. And the chap who said he couldn't come to my lecture last night, undoubtedly was one such manifestation, because he had been a professor at Chico State, which is pretty successful. So that's option two, of the first of the worldly options. The second of the worldly options was to try to transform society. And society, in this respect, is of course class society, it's capitalist society, but it's also the society that was persecuting the Jews, because persecutions of Jews were actually mounting towards the end of the 19th century. And any intelligent person could see a tremendous historical crisis brewing as the tectonic plates of the history of that time converged towards the catastrophic developments that we know from the First and Second World Wars, and the rise of Nazism, the rise of Bolshevism, and the terrible struggles that ensued, leading up to, of course, the Holocaust. So this is not a trivial matter, but the option, the second option, worldly option, is the one that I myself endorse as a Jew, which means that maybe I'm not an ordinary Jew, because my option is to try to transform society. To do that, I have to take a universal perspective. I have to not accept the terms of anti-Semitism and try to transform a society that generates anti-Semitism. The last option, Zionism, is to lead that society, build a nation-state in historic Palestine, and that means correlatively to accept the terms of anti-Semitism. It's a really interesting quotation from a man named J.Kovel, who was the editor of the Encyclopedia Judaica in 1927. This is obviously a very extremely learned and influential Jewish man in the community, and he said, this is a quote, it's from Lenny Brenner's very important book, Zionism in the Age of Dictators. Plotskin says, if anti-Semitism is not true, then Zionism cannot be true. Anti-Semitism being true means that the Jew is perpetually to be an outcast, that the Jew has no place or role within European society, that the only thing to do is to actually leave, which is exactly the anti-Semite light, or the more benign interpretation. So that expulsion in that level, and rather than social transformation, is preferable. Okay, and that indeed is one of the deep contradictions of Zionism, because as the Zionists learned, if they wanted to have their nation state, they couldn't do it on their own. They had to do it with a powerful patron, so they also would have to become the clients of a great imperial power. So even though they were talking about, anti-Semitism must be true, they also were talking of themselves as an outpost of the West in this area of historic Palestine. Now, the next level of contradiction has to do with the fact that although the Jews wanted a nation state, they were not, by any true sense of the word, a nation at that point, simply because of the fact that for several thousands of years they had lived all over the planet and had no particular allegiance to any territory, which is what's necessary for nationhood. There's nothing wrong with that. It made the Jews what Stalin would call rootless cosmopolitans. And then I don't agree with much of Stalin, to say the least, but I think that's okay. And I think it's all right to be a rootless cosmopolitan. It's a rather interesting way of being, isn't it? Cosmopolitan. You can put that on your website or something. So, but the Zionists were caught up in all of these contradictory matters. It's very important to bear in mind that they weren't a true nation, but they wanted to be a state, which meant they had to obtain the territory to be a state on, and had to do it, needless to say, by conquest, because if they wanted a habitable territory, that habitable territory is filled with inhabitants, and inhabitants do not like to be displaced. There has never once been an instance in the history of the world when a colonized people welcomed the colonizers and said, "Oh, great, take my land, it's a free gift." You know, particularly in this case, but we think it's even more poignant in this case because the displaced people were already oppressed people who had been living under the yoke, or rather benign yoke, on the whole, nonetheless the yoke of the Ottoman Empire for centuries, and had themselves no autonomy. And all of a sudden, here come these Europeans saying, "Would you please step aside? We would like to have your land." Now, that's not going to work unless violence is achieved. The Jewish fascist revisionist Vladimir Jabotinsky, of course, was very clear about that back in the 1920s, and although the mainstream of Zionism abhorred him and wouldn't agree with anything of the sort, if you look at their inner councils and the things they were writing for themselves, they perfectly agreed, yes, this has to be a violent process. It cannot take place except by force of arms. And just think of the contradiction there when this conquest, which is transgressive in the extreme, because it's what's worse than robbing the land of an entire people, is carried out by people who do so in the name of their innocence and victimhood. And this is, of course, the Jewish identity. Victimhood, innocence, and indeed ethical superiority. I was fed this diet as a nice Jewish boy in Brooklyn in my early days, and I'm sure many of you would agree that this is indeed the ethos of being Jewish. Now, this is when you're stuck with the practice that demands constant transgression and the identity which is there, that you are a higher being, you're going to be on very thin moral ice for eternity. Okay? And a number of things are going to happen, one of which is you're going to be extremely sensitive to criticism and likely to lash out at critics, either calling them anti-Semites, which see, Zionism is trying to escape anti-Semitism, but also is dependent upon anti-Semitism. That's another layer of contradiction. If they didn't have anti-Semitism, then they had no way to account for the criticism that others, including other Jews like myself, are open. Or the Jew is supposed to be self-hating. If you think I'm self-hating, well, all right. I mean, I can't help it. I can't prove that I'm not self-hating. If you observe me, do you think I'm self-hating? I don't. Okay. In any case, all right, I'm not a self-hating Jew. I'm a Zionist-hating Jew. I admit I have a certain harsh conscience. I mean, conscience tells me that if I don't speak out against this, what I consider monstrosity of Zionism, it's laid out as indictment in the book, you read, listen to this. And my conscience tells me if I don't do that, then I'm not a worthwhile person. And, well, a good human being. Good human being. I don't know if I'm a good human being, but I know I'm not a good human being is somebody who allows this to be gotten away with when it is his own country and his own community that has contributed to be so deeply to it. So that is, my ethos. In a sense, I fear my own conscience more than I fear the external authorities. Let the external authorities do what they will to me. I have to speak what I think is true. I think this is not a bad way of dealing with the situation. But when you do so, you're going to create a lot of problems. Now, the reason you create these problems is that there is this massive machine called the Israel lobbies. And we have to understand that these lobbies, of which the Stand With Us Michigan is one extrusion, one layer upon other layers, that they exist for a very definite purpose. One is they exist within the logic of the bad conscience. They become, so to speak, that institutionalization of the tendency in the bad conscience to lash out at critics. And in this case, the critics include, intellectuals like myself, but also politicians. Barack Obama is a politician, and he's between a rock and a hard place because they don't trust him, and so they're on his case all the time. They don't trust him. His middle name is Hussein. He belongs to a black congregation in Chicago, whose pastor has indeed been critical of the state of Israel, and seriously so, and he won't repudiate him. He has on occasion expressed sympathies for Palestinians in the past, and not too distant past either. And so you can read the Zionist, scuttlebutt. They really don't trust him, and they're constantly very, very fearful. Now, part of that fear is because of the logic of the bad conscience, but that fear becomes functional and facultative because it suits the geostrategic and political realities as well. It turns out that in making a deal with empire, first with Britain, and that they cast that off, and now the United States, and they are our attack dog, or we are also their, I don't know what we are. We're a very bizarre place in relationship with the state of Israel. And I'm not going to dwell on that right now because that would take us too far afield at the moment. I just want to say that the fact of the matter is, and you perhaps all know this, but I want to absolutely reinforce it, absent the support of the United States, the state of Israel would collapse. It's been that way for a long time, and even though it's very powerful, the fourth largest military in the world and so on, its whole being depends both on the military and economic support on the one hand, but also, and just as importantly, the political support, the kind of backing up of the UN for all of its transgressions. And I want to just get at this notion a little bit more deeply so you can see what is driving this creature known as the Zionist state of Israel, because the United States is necessary for Israel, but it's necessary for Israel to do things that are extremely criminal and transgressive, things that the American people, and actually the American Jewish people themselves, would reject if they knew anything about in depth or in the condition of being able to look calmly and dispassionately at this. And that kind of a condition means that Israel is extremely sensitive to anything getting out in the way of free discourse and open debate. They can't afford it, really. And the Israel lobby, with its various repressive arms, which we haven't analyzed, but we can do so later, exists to stifle any kind of debate, because any kind of debate would begin to open up a very dark side of the state of Israel that would cause the support to rapidly dissolve. And it will most rapidly dissolve in an area that I'm going to turn to shortly, but I just want to emphasize the reason the Israel lobby is so raucous and absolute is twofold. One is because that's the inner dynamic of the bad conscience. The other is that it's necessary in order to defend this indefensible relationship with the United States. Slightest deviation from that, the whole thing becomes crashing down. And that is why the politics of anti-Zionism is actually a very hopeful politics, because you can make very big changes with rather small interventions. And the times are in fact changing in this respect, because thanks to the unholy relationship between the US and Israel, as you know, we have gotten into this nightmarish war in the Middle East. And again, if you want to take that up in the question period, you can go into the details of it, but the fact of the matter is the Iraq war would not have happened without major interventions from the state of Israel. And since the Iraq war is turning into such a nightmare and such a horror, it's starting to provoke questioning of Zionism on the part of even the ruling classes. And so there's an inter-ruling class division here, which has major implications. two books besides from my own. I mean, there are a bunch of books like mine, and Ali Amina's, and Jimmy Tilly's, and other books that have been very critical of Israel, but we're sort of, on the left. But there are two books from the center that have come out that have had major impacts. One is the Walter Mearsheimer book, which came out first as an article in the Atlantic Monthly, and then was published, came out as a book last fall, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, written from a perspective of U.S. realism in foreign policy. In other words, one that I myself would disregard and give much too much credence to the basic ethos of Zionism, but nonetheless says that Israel has become a strategic liability and so forth. This is basically the mainstream from the first Bush administration reasserting its power through Chicago and the University of Chicago and Harvard, Kennedy School, over the neoconservative ultra-Zionists that the second Bush administration brought into power. That's the struggle going on. It's an important struggle. The other one is given away the title of the very book written by President Jimmy Carter. This is the key point here. I want to dwell on increasingly in the last part of my talk. He writes this book a little over a year ago called Palestine, Peace, Not
Apartheid.
Apartheid. Woo! Apartheid. Oh my goodness gracious. Now, if you know anything about this, you'll know that there has been efforts over the course of time to identify the state of Israel and Zionism with racism. Strange, isn't it? I mean, you might as well identify the Pope with being Catholic. You have to be racist if you're a Zionist Jewish state. Okay? This gets back to the bad conscience. How are you going to justify the ethnic cleansing that is your salient project? What you have to do is sustain your Jewish identity with this Jewish state, unless you derogate and dehumanize the people to whom you're doing this. You cannot. If you treat them as full, equal human beings, then you have to give them full, equal political rights. If you treat them as monsters, or even as non-existent, like Golda Meir did in '69 when she said they don't exist, it's crazy stuff, but it reveals the abyss in the Zionist heart there. Then you can say, well, they don't exist, or they don't exist as human beings, or they exist as barbarous terrorists. And that, in fact, that's the game that Obama is playing when he says, oh my God, Israel is being beset with these terrorists who are launching the weapons at them, the missiles at their towns, completely disregarding what's causing the whole process, which is to say, disregarding the actual humanity of the Palestinian people, and therefore perpetuating the terror and annihilation of Palestinian society. So there is nothing more salient than the charge of racism. When it was passed by the UN Assembly in 1977, I believe it was, maybe earlier, there was a great deal of consternation. And the U.S. gradually fought to get it reversed, finally got it reversed in 1991 through the exercises of one John Bolton, who became, UN ambassador under Bush, a highly dubious character, to say the least, and an example of a Christian Zionist, because Bolton was even Jewish, but he was an ardent defender of the state of Israel. In 2001, it took a trip by Colin Powell to disrupt the Durban Conference on Racism, which was going to renew that charge against Israel. Powell came in and bullied his way around and basically walked out and kind of wrecked the conference, because once again Zionism is going to be called racism. Now, in 2006, or early 2007, I forget the exact date, comes Jimmy Carter, again, member of the liberal center foreign policy, wanting to express his displeasure with the Bush administration's full spectrum dominance and preemptive warfare and the like, comes in, puts that word apartheid in the title. And this time it sticks because there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, they can scream at Carter, but the more they scream at Carter, using the Zionist lobby mentality, the more the Carter's books sell. And the publisher originally printed 330,000 copies and sold 500,000 copies. I don't know how many people read the book, it doesn't matter. It planted the idea apartheid. Because let's face it, it don't have to be very sophisticated intellectually to draw the conclusion, apartheid, I heard about that, that was South Africa. But what happened to South Africa? Oh my gosh, we changed it. We got rid of that racist state. Oh, well, Israel is apartheid. What next? Okay. And that is so important, you cannot imagine. You know, I mean, power, as Hobbes pointed out, is the capacity to give names and enforce definitions. If you can enforce the definition that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, then people will be deeply troubled to make that criticism. And even Jews who really are not fond of Israel will be reluctant to speak out for fear of being daubed with that dreadful term. Okay. Same thing. Power declares any notion that Israel is a racist society off limits. But any sentient person looking at this society would say it's not only a racist society, but it's about as racist a society as can exist by any measure of that term. In fact, Bishop Tutu, you know, the Nobel laureate and leader of the black liberation struggle in South Africa, when asked after a visit, is Israel an apartheid state like South Africa? He said, no, it's really worse. And he's right, it is worse. It's really worse, because apartheid's point was to preserve enough of black integrity so that they could function as workers. They had to get up in the morning and be able to work in the mines and the mills of the South African powerhouse. Israel's job remains to annihilate them and get rid of them. That's a big difference, but it's a big difference within the framework of racism, but not just racism that you find on the streets, but racism that's structured at the level of the state. That having gotten to that point, which is the key point of the book's reasoning, I would go on and say this. Since the goal here is to break with taboos and disregard them, including taboos that are criticizing Israel, against criticizing Israel, taboos against calling Israel racist. What about the next taboo, which is maybe the last bastion of the defense, which is that Israel is truly flawed, no doubt, but in the words of many people, including Walter Mersheimer, and many liberals who give talks and say at the beginning of the talk, oh well, I know Israel has problems, but let's begin with saying Israel has the right to exist. Israel has the right to exist. And that is a statement that is almost always accepted without any reflection at all. But if you think about it for a minute, it's an extremely permeable and dubious statement that has almost no reality behind it. Because if Israel has the right to exist, by which we mean to say that it should always be what it is, namely a Jewish state that preserves a Jewish majority, i.e. a Zionist state. If that is the case, then Israel is different from all other states, because no other state has the right to exist. I'm not saying states necessarily should be made not to exist, but the history of the state is, at least the history of the modern state, is that it's established as not having an inherent right to exist, and that principle is enunciated in our own Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. And that is the basis of the democratic idea. And Jefferson went further by saying, you know, I think it'd be better to have a revolution every 20 years to clean out the state and change it basically. We don't mean changing the government now, we mean changing the nature of the social contract. That's the difference. Israel can have one prime minister or another and so on, but as long as it has the right to exist, that's all it will have. But the question is, why must you accept that right to exist? It doesn't hold water, and it's just another taboo that deserves to be overcome with all the others. And when you do, a rather interesting perspective opens up. You can begin thinking of maybe working very hard over a very long period of time with many, many people from around the world, joining hands, people of goodwill, people of goodwill, Palestinian people of goodwill, people within Israel who currently are not anywhere close to this state of mind where they might contemplate the existence of a basic change, but who can be brought to that position. Why? Because their state is hopeless. Okay, it is going nowhere, and you have to establish this point. You can do it through many different ways, by the series of indictments that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, or you can mention it. You can do it by exploring the logical or practical impossibility of making any real changes along the lines of a two-state solution. Two-state solution, which people talk about as having a Palestinian state alongside the Israeli state, is wrong on any number of levels. Okay, it's practically impossible because the Israel occupation has destroyed the possibility of a second state emerging in any coherent way at all. Not the least because of these 450,000 settlers who shouldn't be there, who constantly steal Palestinian land and dump their garbage and their waste on the rest of Palestine. It's a total wreck. Okay? It's impossible to conceive of a real state being built at that point. More than that, nobody has ever, in power, has ever talked about the Palestinian state as being a sovereign state, as being a state that has control of its foreign policy, truly controls its borders, it has its own sovereign institutions, its own army. They never talk about that. They only talk about the Palestinian state being kind of a reasonably cleaned up affair that Palestinians can live in with some degree of dignity and under the tutelage of the Israeli army. In other words, the two-state solution, as it's talked about, is actually a measure to bring Israel up to the level of South Africa in the apartheid era. It doesn't get any better than that. And if you thought that apartheid South Africa did not deserve a life, which we all did, and people of goodwill around the world did, then why should you not make the same claim for Israel? There's no reason not to make that claim. Okay. So you have the existing one-state racist solution, which is producing nightmares. You have the impossibility on a moral, political ground. Another thing with the two-state solution is that when you get, if they had a Palestinian state, say in the territories, you know what one of the first things they'd want to do in Israel is to expel the Israeli Arabs to that state. Because that's their logic. And they can do it, and they would want to do it because the two-state solution would preserve the Israeli state in its given form, which, as we've seen, is a machine for manufacturing human rights abuses and ethnic cleansing. We have 60 years of proof of that. Case closed, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's just moral cowardice to try to think, well, maybe they're going to reform. They've been given every chance in the world that should be transformed, not reformed. That's my view of it, okay? I want to just close this by putting this on the moral plane which it deserves to be. In my view, and I've given a lot of thought to this, I think that the struggle against Zionism is the moral equivalent of the struggle against slavery. I think it is the same moral weight as the struggle against slavery.
And that is, how many of you were involved in the civil rights movement? How many? Even in a small one? Okay. Okay. But, you know, we're used to the idea that we give money for humanitarian aid to the suffering Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Food, medicine, all these things. Did we give food and medicine to the suffering in the civil rights movement here, or did we start a civil rights movement that liberated them? Where the progress of African Americans in this country since I was a kid in the 50s has been achieved by asserting human rights, by asserting the civil rights. And we need to do the same for Palestinians. It's time to invest our donations and our efforts in a civil rights movement for Palestinians. Well, that's what ISM does. That's what a number of other organizations do. So please do give your money to buy food and medicine and clothing and all this sort of thing. But don't forget to support civil rights in Palestine, nonviolent resistance in Palestine. There's plenty of it, and it needs your help. One thing that a lot of you know about is that we're taking some boats into Gaza this summer. We're not asking Israeli permission to go into. This is a nonviolent resistance movement. All of this needs your support, and there's plenty of nonviolent resistance going on in Palestine right now. So I ask you to help our effort. Please be as generous as you can, and not just with your money, with your time. And come join us, please. So thank you very much. And Joel will be signing books, but first, your questions. Thank you.
Okay, we have however much time we have. So.
Hi, you were a psychoanalyst, and I was reading something online. I wanted to know your opinion regarding Freud and the beginning of psychoanalysis. I think this was from Cal State professor Kevin McDonald, who's written books on Judaism and evolutionary aspects of it. But he described it as kind of there was a sort of a cult aspect to it. That Jung was sort of a face, and there was an agenda, however conscious, to sort of bring down the confidence of the Victorian kind of founding Northwestern European cultures. You know, they had discriminated against Jews. Do you think there's anything to that there was sort of an element of unconscious or not?
Well, the history of the psychoanalytic movement is not easily summarized in kind of generalizations like that. There's no question that Freud belonged to that type of Jew who felt keenly the marginality of Jewish people, and there's very interesting anti-Semitic episodes in his own childhood that he dwelt on and interpreted in his own dreams. And his masterwork, which is the interpretation of dreams, has a lot of that. And there was an extreme consciousness of psychoanalysis as a Jewish profession from the start, and that's one reason why Freud sought out Carl Gustav Jung as a non-Jewish Protestant psychoanalyst, sort of to blunt the criticisms of the anti-Semites in that respect. So there's some truth to that, but I wouldn't use the word cult. I mean, because it's a bourgeois profession also, and it's tied up with membership in scientific legitimations, and it's almost sui generis. This is probably not the time to go into detail about that. But I think that's what you just quoted to me is an overly generalized view of something that has all those elements, but they're combined in many, many complex ways. I think us in the back.
Thanks, hi Joel. That was, as always, cogent and eloquent, and with a very interesting analysis of a number of points. There's one chapter on racism in Israel that I think you left out the way in which the state of Israel also generally leaves it out, which is internal racism. Racism in Israel is not simply just Palestinian versus Jew, but the Mizrahim, so where you actually have racism against Yemeni, Moroccan Jews. And what's interesting is the way in which there are liberation movements which attempt to be able to confront state racism in Israel on behalf of the Mizrahim and to make common cause with Palestinians. So I would think that it would be nice to have you comment on this other dimension of racism and anti-racism within Israel.
That's a very cogent question, and I totally accept it. In the book itself, there's a fair discussion of this, and I'm glad you brought it up. It calls attention to a peculiarity of Zionism that must be appreciated. Any understanding of the phenomenon is gained, and that is, despite its claims that this is the universal, Jew at stake here, whose life and identity and being is at stake, is anything but. It's the Ashkenazi Jew, of which I'm a member. You know, and my people, you know, come from Ukraine, and there's many implications of this. Not that my people come from Ukraine. There are implications of that too. But that's not what I'm getting at. The point is that the first point is that it further demolishes, if any demolition is needed, the outrageous argument that somehow the Jewish people as a whole were promised the state of Israel, which once was their kingdom, because in point of fact, the vast majority of the Ashkenazim who conquered Palestine in the name of the state of Israel had never had anything to do with any of their generations. I mean, just as an aside, I had my DNA tested, and you know, went up from Africa and did indeed go up the Nile Valley and then along the coast of the Mediterranean, that's now Palestine and Lebanon and all that, but did so 20,000 years ago. You know, it was not found out with historic, you know, Palestine, which was a great welter of national and subnational and tribal movements that resists any kind of classification, and certainly resists extension into the lives of Jews in the diaspora. It's not strictly a myth, but it's a very potent myth, and the you know, internal psychology of the Ashkenazi Jew is very necessarily developed. It's one where a great deal of imbibement of the European racism is then turned out also to Jews of the Orient, as you mentioned, which are Jews of enormous range, okay? And it's a very long, complex history here. I have some outrageous events that you know, I picked up off the history books, and then I don't want to take up our time. There are many terrible things, but I think that one of the great indictments against Israel, and I think if I ever do a second edition of the book, and I get back to that thing with the list of the rooms in the hypothetical museum where all the crimes are enunciated, I think one of the crimes was very definitely, very strongly, the extirpation of the internal variety of Judaism, the great wealth of Judaic being. And there's a rather good book, a very large book edited by David Bialy, I think the University of California Press, if I'm not mistaken, came out about 3-4 years ago, called The Cultures of the Jews. It's about 1,500 pages, and it shows the great complexity and richness of Jewish being, which is a wonder. I mean, just like any human, you know, any human capacity for efflorescence in many different ways, and you know, all the way from Morocco to India, and you know, up into you know, Central Asia and the like, including Iran, and where there's still 26,000 Jews who refuse to be seduced into going to Israel. The Iraqi Jews who were back there since King Nebuchadnezzar in 800 BCE, were terrorized to go to Israel, and most of them bitterly regret it, because what's happened as a result of Israel is not that the Jewish being is allowed to flower, nothing of the sort. What you see is an imposition of the stifling, you know, regimentation of, you know, Western bourgeois consumer capitalism upon Jewish beings. So there's this terrible elimination of alternative cultures within. As for the resistances, that's very complex too, because, you know, some of them resist, some of them don't. Whether they can form alliances with Palestinians is an open question. There are many more fractions here than, you know, than one is able to encompass. But the generalization, namely that this is a profoundly and internally and inherently racist situation, is the, you know, is the dominant theme that must be kept in mind in all of it. Okay. There's a woman.
I got a
woman in the back. Okay, lady in the back.
I'll get to her in a second.
Oh, yeah. Wait. Okay. I wanted to choose a woman.
No problem.
Thank you.
And you can go there.
Thank you very much for writing this and going around and speaking. And I really like your idea of the museums, and I haven't read your book yet. But do I understand? Okay. And I like the fact that you're connecting the indigenous experience and this European conquest that's gone so bad. And I like the idea of the museums, but so I don't know if you then, that's a recognition of what happened. But then there's the need to then begin to brainstorm and to begin to institute ways to make amends to the descendants alive now and in the future. Because that's where the transformation is going to happen here, even like in California, where we get into the native people of California, that we have to come to terms with what happened, but then we have to come to terms with what it is now. And then we begin to brainstorm with the people alive now about how do we make this change to make amends for what happened and to actually bring something that's human now. And I don't know if that was included in your book, but if it wasn't, I hope it will be.
But you put it very well, and much more can be said. I mean, the notion of a one-state solution, which is sort of the general category of my approach, is one that I call a strategic goal that is necessary because it allows human rights and universal human values to be the guiding principle and does not tolerate the notion of a Jewish state, which I think is intolerable. But it leaves vast terrain unexplored. And basically, that exploration has to be by the people on the ground, okay? And that is, so in my view of the politics of all this, well, there's a certain politics of truth-telling, and which I think is absolutely necessary. There's the politics of sanctioning Israel to make them feel that they've done something really wrong, and not in a violent way, but non-violent. Boycotts and divestments is a very basic thing because it will heighten their sense of vulnerability and produce moral, moral doubts on their part, and so on. And then there's a question of Palestinian return, which must be reinforced. These are the basic principles, but along with that has to be a very, very patiently and creatively carried out practice over a long period of time of bringing the peoples together in the context of that. I want to emphasize something here. I beg that we do not succumb to a sort of facile, sort of psychotherapeutic model of the transformation of Israel, that only the people communicate with each other and everything will be all right. Everything will not be all right unless the power of Zionist institutions and the Israel Defense Force is broken. I mean, that's what makes it better. But to break that power without also reconstituting society and, for instance, having institutions which are very creative in South Africa, like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. This is something that brought about a great deal of pain, but also internal reflection. And that book takes up some of it. There's an Israeli NGO called Zokrot, which I praise, not because it's so unique, but it's paradigmatic. It's a group headed by a man named Eitan Bornstein, who's a wonderful Argentinian Jew who's been there for about 30 years, and he goes around with his people and they put up place names on the Palestinian towns that have been erased, and then the Israelis come and take it down and come back and put up another place name. And in this way they start kind of a dialogue and a remembering and a reflection, but always has to be in the context of a transformation of power. It's very, very wrong to just think, oh, well, there's just competing narratives, because then you get into the things of which the Jews suffered so much and the Palestinians suffered so much, all well and good. But the point is the Jews, as Zionists, stole the land, and that has to be taken away and reversed, and then on that basis, reconciliation can develop. It's a long, drawn-out process. My old friend, Dean Stewart. I'm sorry, you're next. I can go on all night. I don't, we have to leave, but...
this is a question I'm sure somebody else is planning to ask, but I might as well ask it. Before I ask it, you know that Ali Abunimah, in his book...
One Country.
Yes, One Country. Includes a critique of Obama and his position on Palestine, and he starts with Obama's former pro-Palestinian public statements, and then he goes on from there. and analyzes the change that took place and the political impulses beneath it. So what I want to ask you is, given Obama's present positions and given the letter that Paul read to us, and given Hillary's raving pro-Zionism, what's a good anti-Zionist to do?
Well, a good anti-Zionist you can vote something else, but let's say, you know, I'm not going to vote for a Democrat, you know, but I don't know what I'll vote for. That's right. Let's smash the blue buses. Smash. Thank you. In the case, no, it's not the end of the case. The fact of the matter is that we're going to get a president the next time around, and whoever it is, you have to hold their feet to the fire. I happen to personally, even though I don't tend to vote for him, think that there's maybe a 5% chance that Obama will do something really interesting. There's a 0% chance that Hillary will do something interesting. That's what I think. But that's not going to make me like turn around. I do think that my reading, however, of political candidates is not based upon what they say, the positions they take in the campaign, but it's really based upon, you know, an analysis of the, you know, this structures of capitalist democracy and the, you know, real power system. You have to remember that the best president of the 20th century is Franklin Roosevelt, and when he ran for president in 1932, he ran as a Hoover Democrat. He basically supported everything that Hoover was doing, and only when he got into office did he, you know, waken up and be able to do something really interesting. You know, similarly, Lincoln, probably the best president we ever had, was a nobody. You know, he only had two years in the House of Representatives. There's nothing to base it on. But he, you know, he had great instincts. So it's really, very little matters what they say. You know, but everything matters in kinds of pressure you can put on them once they're, you know, in office. And there's a great deal that can be done. That's where the politics comes from. Yes.
Got this man back here.
I wasn't going to mention this, but when you talk about truth and reconciliation, you know, it reminds me of getting the two men who beat and tortured Emmett Till for hours and hours and hours and let them bleed out their terrible little feelings without punishment. I think it's excuse me, that's not what I want to talk about. You just upset me when you said that. I commend you for supporting the one-state solution. And because last night, I think it was Norman Finkelstein or 94, debunked and mocked and insulted those who didn't support a two-state solution. The second state being less than 22%.
Right.
But I would like to bring your attention that the original Palestinian Communist Party, which was both Jewish, Arab, Armenian, Greek, Assyrian, whatever, everyone who lived there, their policy was a multinational Jewish Arab worker-centered worker state in the Socialist Federation of the Middle East. Now, I would like, another thing that's brought up is the control of the Jewish section of the American capitalist class and the Zionist lobby of U.S. imperialism. Jeff Blanford, I believe, explicates that position. I'd very much like to hear from him tonight, though I don't agree with him. I think it's an issue that the left needs to grapple with, and is how much power does this Zionist lobby have? Is it conferred to it by U.S. imperialism, or does it dominate U.S. imperialism? It's an important question. I think Israel's a junior partner of U.S. imperialism. The U.S. imperialism is a major enemy, not Zionism. And long before there was Zionism, there was untold slaughter by U.S. imperialism and the rest of imperialism. Thank you very much. Sorry about the amount of time.
No, that's all right. I was just raising a question. It will take me like half an hour to answer this one. I'm going to be very brief about it, but I don't think this is an adequate answer. I think it's very important issues you raise. I mean, yes, I do think that the original Palestinian Communist Party had the right idea. The partition agreement of 1947 set the whole thing on a disastrous course. That was Truman's doing because he was ready to be taken over by Zionists. And so the politics are all complex, but we understand. And the reason I want to reinforce it is this: that the great disaster that happened in South Africa after the end of the apartheid regime had nothing to do with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which actually did some good. It had everything to do with, don't frown, it did some good. It did some good because it followed upon a transformation in power, okay? That's what mattered. It's done in replacement or substitution for a transfer of power, then it does no good. It does harm. But the point I want to make is that the great grievous flaw of South Africa was that the movement away from apartheid occurred with the collusion of the global bourgeoisie and global capital, and that the IMF immediately rolled over and made cut a deal with the IMF, the ANC cut a deal with the IMF, and Nelson Mandela, who now is being considered a traitor by many blacks in Africa because he allowed global capital to take over. So you have this horrible situation with the first world economy, the fourth world economy, so yeah, the economic going on and on. Now, so one point I want to leave us with at this level, because we can't settle everything tonight, is this, that the one-state solution, if and when it comes, will not be worth very much unless it comes in the context of a socialist development. Okay, I want to really emphasize that. I say that in the book. Yes, okay. I think that, and I've spoken to Palestinians, and other people have too, who have a lot of misgivings about a one-state solution because they say, you know, all right, we're going to have a political majority, demographic majority, but those bastards are still going to control the economic institutions, and they're just going to have us as peons, and they're going to control the state eventually, and just do all the terrible things that have been done in South Africa. I think that that is a definite possibility, and it's something that we have to really factor into this situation and put in the foreground of our practice. Okay? Sir, yes, behind you. Yes, gentleman. Yes, you. Yes, you. Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody wants to speak, and I'm going to turn it to this side of the room. I wish somebody else would call on people, frankly, but I'll do the best I can.
Can you tell us about the Israeli left, both in terms of numbers and moral courage?
The numbers are shrinking. There's some wonderful people, but they're really in very small amounts. They've been thoroughly intimidated and demoralized. The Israeli left at this moment, in my view, is not a potent force, but it doesn't mean it can't become so, because it has been so in the past, and they're human beings and they have the capacity for transformation. But right now, I think the ball is in the court of the Palestinians and of the global, solidarity movements to try to bring enough pressure on Israel to wake up some of the people there and set them up in motion. One of the bad features, I want to be very frank here, of the situation is compared to South Africa and in the 20 or so years before apartheid collapsed, Israel has a very, very weak internal left, where South Africa had a very powerful internal left. Okay? And part of that has to do with the fact, of course, that there was this class-based union movement, and a communist party that had some real force to it. But also even bourgeois, radicals who were motivated by humanitarian and anti-racist motives. Very little of that is in Israel at this time. But, so what? We can't give up on that account. We just have to work with that and try to reduce that formation in the state of Israel. Now I'm going to take some people over here. You had it. Gentlemen in the red vest.
I'm a 1990 graduate of Bard College.
Whoa. I was there then.
Unfortunately, I didn't have you.
Take my course.
Dave Heather. Your story about the Jewish fellow who wouldn't come to your lecture reminds me of what I face a lot being a 9/11 Truth activist. And just curious where you stand on 9/11 Truth, and more importantly, how do we combat the state's use of super patriotism to get people to look at what their own state is doing?
Well, I mean, patriotism is a powerful motive, but it's certainly capable of being demystified. And Many good slogans. Theodore Roosevelt said, you know, the duty of a patriot is to protect his country from its government, and so on and so forth. You can say things like that. It should say things like that. Be organized. Let me just say very briefly. I'm broadly sympathetic with the 9/11. The only thing I know is that what I've been told is wrong with the government. I think that at the very least, they knew it was going to happen and simply allowed it to happen because they convinced them that, you know, because they knew that that was the only way they could get what they wanted. On September 10, 2001, Bush's presidency was already failed. On September 12th, he was the most powerful president in American history. That stinks to high heaven. We have all that evidence. I don't know very much about, I know a lot about, but I don't have firmly formed opinions about any of the numerous, you know, points about more active complicity. I read it thoroughly. I haven't ruled out I ruled out some things are less plausible than others, but I'm open to a lot of stuff. One thing I do want to add to this, though, that whatever there is in the way of deepening this, our understanding of this horrible atrocity, we must take account of the state of Israel. And that is not done sufficiently, I think, even by the movement that you seem to represent. As I say, there are two. Well, there's a book by Justin Raimondo, but you know, he's at antiwar.com, and pick that up on that website. You know, there's these two episodes, two incidents with the Israeli art students who were going around the country tracking the 19 Saudis and, you know, obviously Mossad agents. And then even more ominously, there were the 4 guys on the roof who were high-fiving each other as the towers went down, and there was a 5th one, and they had that, you know, pick up that panel truck, and they were arrested, and they were clearly Israeli agents. And so I've spoken to people about that. I've read a lot about it, and the story breaks off because they failed polygraph tests. They were sent back to Israel, and you know, into a black hole. And will we ever know what happened? I don't know, but that something big happened with the state of Israel, I'm certain of that. I mean, those are incontrovertible facts. It shows that there was some serious, you know, manipulation and collusion going on, which, you know, the point before about the Israel lobby and who's in charge. It's such a complex situation. You know, the Israel lobby and Israel itself is not always U.S. is a little lapdog. I mean, it's not a puppet. Israel is not a puppet state. Right. Puppets do not control the government of the, you know, the puppeteer. That's right. Israel does control the government of the puppeteer. That's right. In this case, so it's not a puppet. It's not like you know, El Salvador or something. You know, some tin horn dictatorship or Saddam Hussein when he was, you know, iron and so on and so forth. It's much too complicated than that. Just remember, this is the government that bombed the U.S. liberty in the 1967 war, right. and taken completely off the, you know, the charts. Lyndon Johnson said they're not going to touch this. So very, very weird stuff goes on between these countries, and we just have to constantly evaluate it, including the obvious implications with 9/11. So
one thing, the next question, we're going to end soon, so one more question. So we got one final question.
Stay all night.
No. Sorry, we have a certain amount of time here, so sorry.
He said if we can stay all night.
I'm told I'm responsible.
Okay. This one in the back. Thank you. Yes, you.
Hi, I want to say it's really interesting. This is my anti-Zionism week because I did go to the Finkelstein lecture as well. And both of you really are sort of pointing to the same evidence to see, you know, major cracks in the edifice of the Zionist control and narrative. And so that's really interesting that you agree sort of on what's happening and then go off in these very different directions about what is to be done. But one thing I was trying to think a lot afterwards about, I mean, I think that Norman Finkelstein's attitude is that there is already a consensus about the two-state solution, and therefore we shouldn't shift gears at this point. We should, work on what the UN has agreed to and the World Court and so on. But I find problems with both the one-state and the two-state because I don't see how practically they're going to happen, either of them. And one thing that you said that sort of made me jump is you said that Israel would collapse without the support of the United States. And I wonder if you could comment further on that, because I kind of see Israel just going right on trucking without us very happily.
All right. This will be the last question, but it raises some very important issues that I can summarize what I've said before. I'm glad that Norman came through. I'm glad you can see there are differences between people who are both very severe critics of Israel. Obviously, we disagree. I heard him. I didn't hear. I was in Sacramento when he spoke myself, but I heard him in Edinburgh, and we had a little disagreement afterwards. And about the one-state, two-state thing. And I know where he stands. Respecting Berkeley, the problem I have with his analysis is that he disregards the necessity of agency from below, that struggle makes a real difference here. And that he's too willing to accept the fact that courts and the UN has set out a certain line without criticizing the UN and courts and realizing that the powers that be that are constructing the two-state alternative are themselves very dubious powers. I mean, why not add who really is for the two-state solution, which is Olsen and Bush and Condoleezza Rice? I mean, are those to be your guides? I mean, it's a safe rule of thumb that if Bush and Condoleezza Rice want something, it's almost certain to be highly undesirable. And Norman just seems to go along with it. I asked him, you seem you don't problematize the two-state solution. Now, my book has about 10 pages on this because it's a very important point. I think it's morally wrong two-state. I think it's politically impossible and the like. I want to emphasize, however, and this is by way of conclusion, two larger points about that. One is that ultimately it's not my decision, it's the decision of the people on the ground, okay? And if they want to end up with a two-state solution, then that's what they're going to end up with, it's not at all clear that that's what they want. If you speak to Palestinians, I don't think they really want a two-state solution. They want something better than that. They don't want to live in a Bantustan. It could work out not really very well on that account. But if that's what they want, or if the Arab states get it together, and impose a kind of a truce and a ceasefire and give recognition to Israel, and in a sense, then the whole Arab world joins in with the Israeli project and tries to normalize it, well, that's what's going to happen, and we'll have to try to work within that. But basically, what I'm trying to do here is to set up a strategic goal, or a sort of a true north, a lodestar. The lodestar is a single state because, okay, if you don't believe in that, if you believe in reproducing the existing system of Israel, then you've accepted the logic of Zionism. To me, the most important thing is what the title of my book conveys, to overcome Zionism. I feel that no matter what we do, no matter how we end up, it will be a better result to the extent that the Zionist way of thinking and the way of being, and the imperialism that is embedded within that, which is reproduced in a two-state solution, is dissolved. To the degree that Zionism is overcome and dissolved. And Zionism is basically revenge. You kill me, you kill my father, I kill your father. A cycle of revenge. Overcoming Zionism is moving to a different level, grounded upon universal human rights. Whether we get there is always a moot point, and given the record of the human species, not to be bet on, you know? But it's the best way to go. It's the only way to go that brings out what is worthwhile in us as human beings, namely the search for a universal human right and a society grounded upon that kind of equivalent dignity of all peoples. That is ultimately the position of all the great emancipatory systems, whether we're talking about Marxism, we're talking about anarchism, you know, or even certain kinds of, you know, religious transformations, of, you know, like Gandhi or something like that. All these things have their own problems, but they're all predicated on some kind of approach towards a world in which people are treated as equivalently divine or endowed by nature with inalienable rights and so on and so forth. That Zionism is the great force that stands in the way of that in the world right now. And it embeds within itself the whole history of North over South, conquest of the Indians, and all the stuff that we understand by the history of imperialism. So it seems to me that even though ultimately we have to be willing to accept the ambiguity of civilized life and all the complexities and failures and so on, you know, unintended consequences, etc., etc. Nonetheless, it really matters if you install that kind of lodestar, that kind of strategic goal that orients your ends and your means, okay, into the framework of universal human rights and demands the overcoming of Zionism. That's what the one-state solution is, and that's why I advocate. Thank you.